And I remember it actually was said in my grad school program, like literally my professor said this, we are here to help people, not make money. And as somebody who grew up lower income, who's taken out a bunch of student loan debt, I'm like, I hope we make some money. I got to pay these loans back. And I was just even curious at that time, like, wasn't it possible to make money and help people? Is it possible to do both? And to your point, if the last thing you want is your therapist struggling with money and stressed out and on the verge of bankruptcy, I mean, how available are they going to be for you if they're not healthy themselves in that way?
Hey, it's Rocky. Welcome to Richer Soul. Today's guest is Brad Klontz to chat about money mindsets and how they might be holding you back. Imagine it's 12 months from now, and you've achieved your major life goals. How does it feel to be in the best shape of your life? To wake up energized, excited about the day? To have great relationships and friends who support you and propel you forward? How does it feel to have an excess of money, to be able to make the choices you want? To be fearless and open to trying new adventures? Imagine being connected to the universe and it providing everything you desire. It's possible over time, and your past does not dictate your future. The only thing holding you back from this vision is you. It's time to take control of our thoughts and use them to our advantage. Welcome to Richer Soul, where we achieve our dreams and bring balance to health, wealth, relationships, time, and spirituality. If you have not had a chance to listen to episodes 1 through 9, I encourage you to go back and listen to the framework behind Richer Soul and how to create the life of your dreams. You can also find all the show notes for this episode at richersoul.com. I always struggled with understanding why more people just didn't build wealth. I couldn't get it. And then I was introduced to Ramit Shetty and Brad Klontz, who helped me to understand about money mindsets and behaviors. And then it all made sense. See, to me, building wealth was nothing more than automated savings and doing the math. I didn't realize how hard this is for most people. I guess it's my superpower. Who knew? It's also the reason I ask that first question of every guest, because of what I've learned from Brad and how much it holds us back. I'm excited to have him on so we can dig deeper. Brad Klontz is a doctor of psychology, a certified financial planner, and an expert in financial psychology, behavioral finance, and financial planning. He's a managing principal at YMW Advisors. He's an associate professor of practice at Creighton University, Heider College of Business, and he is the founder of the Financial Psychology Institute. Dr. Klontz has written 8 books on the psychology of money, and actually it is probably one of my most recommended books that I give out. He's been featured everywhere, including the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and now Richer Soul. I've met him a few times in person, and now you all get to listen to our conversation. Welcome to Richer Soul, Brad Klontz. It's great to have you join us today.
Thanks for having me.
And I'm excited for the conversation. My audience knows what this next question is. What they don't always know is the inspiration behind it, which is actually a lot of the work that I read from you way back when around how people behave with money, because it was something that I could never understand. But we'll chat about that. So let's start with the question. What was it like when you were growing up, and how much did your family and school teach you about money?
Yes. So I have been thinking about this a lot lately, Rocky. It certainly was the inspiration for me trying to figure out the whole psychology of money, was really me trying to figure out my psychology around money. And I'll start towards the middle, I think. And that is after I had racked up $100,000 in student loan debt, getting my doctorate in clinical psychology. I saw a mentor make $100,000 in 1 year day trading. And I thought, he knows nothing about trading for the stock market. I sat and watched him do it once, and he like bought a couple hundred shares of something. I'm like, what is that? And he's like, I have no idea. Click. And he had made money, 100,000 in a year. And I'm like, the guy knows nothing about the stock market. Neither do I. I could do this. So I sold pretty much everything I had of value and I started to trade with it. I had an incredible few months, and then the tech bubble burst and I started to watch the money that I had made and my initial investment just disappear over time because you have all those cognitive biases that pop in, like it's going to come back, it's going to bounce back. I'll sell once the stock is back to what it's worth, which is what I bought at the anchor point I had at which I bought it. Just having this miserable emotional experience watching all this money melt away. And then I asked myself the question that I really do credit with everything I've learned ever since. And it's a question I ask myself all the time in every area of my life. Why would a reasonably intelligent person do something so stupid? That was the question I asked myself. I started to try to answer that question. I went home and I started to interview my mother. And my poor mother had been through this in my training as a clinical psychologist, where, back then we would use tape recorders for those in your audience who are my age. And I would put it in front of her and I would start interviewing her and asking her questions. And so I did that to try to figure out my family system stuff growing up and why my parents divorced when I was 2, that kind of thing. And I did the same thing around money. Mom, what was it like for you growing up around money? What was it like for grandma and grandpa? And just all these stories started to emerge from that interview with my mother. And I had the opportunity to do the same thing with my father. And then I realized, aha, now I know why a reasonably intelligent person would do something so stupid with his money. Like any good psychologist, I just blamed my mother for all my problems. And the stories that emerged, though, really did help me understand that. And so that's the middle. And the way I started is I grew up lower income. My parents divorced when I was 2, which will take you from lower income below lower income, whatever that is. And so I definitely grew up in a family of very hardworking people who were very conscientious, God-fearing, good people who had no money. And so both of my sets of grandparents lived in trailer parks. We didn't have money. And I grew up understanding that it really does suck to be poor. Okay. It actually sucks. There's a lot of stuff you can't do that other people can do. There's a lot of opportunities you miss out on. And so as a child, I remember not liking this and trying to figure out why. Some branches of my family have been in the United States since the Mayflower. And I'm like, why does nobody own any property? Why isn't there a building with our name on it? These were questions I was very curious about as a young age. I was very aware of people who had money and people who didn't. And so I will never forget too, I remember going to a friend's, I must have been in middle school. And I remember going to a friend's house for dinner and I thought they were mega rich because they had more than one bathroom in their house. And to me, that was the level at which you have reached affluence because you didn't have to line up. And I remember even at a young age interviewing my friend's father about what job he had and what he was doing. And I remember I was just hungry to figure out how he got there. And so to sum it up, my relationship with money growing up, low income, definitely aware of the pain involved in that. A lot of situations where, for example, I was gifted martial arts lessons for my birthday and I got 3 months. And by the way, this was at like the local rec center. So it wasn't some sort of expensive dojo anywhere. And after 3 months, that was it. Couldn't afford it anymore. And just those types of experiences as a kid, it's like, oh, that hurts. That hurts to not be able to study karate or whatever it is. And so I think I was hungry as a child to figure out how to not have that experience growing up, not have that experience, and not give my children that experience. That's really what drove me to figure out the psychology. Because I knew it was more than just being smart and working hard. Because I was surrounded by a lot of smart, hardworking people. And so I realized there was more to it that I wanted to learn about.
It's funny. Every time I read a psychology book, I always think of, this is actually a parenting book. The parent screwed up this person and created these psychological things.
There's a pattern.
Out of curiosity, though, where did that thing come from at a young age to just go interview people about their job and what they were doing? Because You also interviewed your mom. Like, there's a pattern there of you having this, desire to do that.
That's an interesting question. It's something I've never thought about, but I'm pretty sure it's because my parents got divorced. So, as I mentioned, my parents got divorced when I was 2. Obviously, I had no idea what was going on at that age. But when I was in elementary school, I do remember, even as young as kindergarten, just being aware that my parents were the only divorced parents in my entire class. I think it's much more popular now, or much more normal. But back then, I felt like I was very abnormal. I felt like I was ashamed of it. And I think at a young age, I was trying to figure out why they divorced so that I wouldn't get a divorce someday and my kids wouldn't be in that situation. So I do remember as a young child trying to figure out and analyze what went wrong in their marriage so that I wouldn't let it happen to me.
It's interesting because that is the premise that keeps coming up. Like, I want to figure out how these things work so I don't have to experience them. And that's not normal for kids, even kids in your situation,
Probably not
because
normal.
most poor kids don't say, how do I not be poor? Many of them, what I have noticed just in asking this question of hundreds and hundreds of people is even the people who grew up poor didn't realize they were poor because that was just what everyone around them was like. So unless you happen to see the dichotomy, it wasn't as prevalent there. It wasn't until they were much older that they realized that they were poor. And I've also noticed that poverty can do one of two things, right? One, it can entrap you and say, this is my lot in life. Or B, for some kids, it turns into the incentive to say, how do I get out of this and how do I not deal with this going forward? And it sounds like that was more so the case with you.
Yeah, I feel very fortunate that I landed there. I'm sure, I bounced around from feeling powerless and hopeless and thinking that, the system is rigged and, rich people are greedy and take advantage of poor people. I know I had all those beliefs. And I don't know, I'm glad that I, to some degree, was open minded. I have an idea about why I was somewhat open minded to other ways of looking at things. It's because I bounced between 2 families my entire life. And on the religious side, my mother and stepfather were very fundamentalist religious adherents with a very strict code of right and wrong. And then on my father's and stepmother, they were much more liberal. So they're actually, I was born in a conservative religious home and a liberal, non religious home. And I bounced back and forth between them. And so I think at a young age, I was sort of blessed with this idea that there's at least in that area, there are 2 totally different ways of looking at the world, totally different ways of looking at 2 different circumstances. And I honestly think that helped translate for me an open-mindedness, if you will, to trying to look at it through a different lens. And also, I was somewhat okay with blaming my own thinking around why I got into the mess I got into, which is an extremely, since then, I've done a lot of research in this area, as you know, and it's a really, really powerful mindset if you're willing to sort of hold yourself accountable for the results you're getting in life. There's a lot of power in that.
There is, because then you're no longer hopeless, right? You're no longer blameless. You're no longer a victim. You have the ability to do something about it, to change it, and to move forward with it. Now, you went into psychology first, correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
What drove you into psychology?
Well, it was, again, it's sort of, I've said, and I've thought about it this way, that my message comes from my mess, you know? And I was actually going into school to be a biologist. And then I took an intro to psychology class. And I was just fascinated with trying to understand and make sense of my family system. I had a sibling who took his own life. I came from a family that had a lot of divorce in it. There was a lot of trauma in it, a lot of loving, kind people, but there was a lot of trauma also. And I think it was me trying to sort that out. Like, how did that have an impact on me? How did that have an impact on my family? And then I got curious in, how can I overcome those experiences and how can I make sure not to replicate, that type of an experience for the rest of my life and for my future children someday. So essentially that is why I got interested in psychology.
You've always had this forward viewpoint of future children. It seems like that future vision, which for a lot of people, they don't have future vision, which is why I think they struggle so much with the concept of compounding and wealth building, is because they don't think beyond the moment. And it sounds like you've always had that. Out of curiosity, do you know your Myers Briggs type?
I do.
Can I guess?
Sure, go ahead.
I'm not sure EI, but NT and maybe NTJ?
It's ENFP. And yeah,
ENFP.
yeah,
Okay.
yep.
Interesting. Okay. There's certain personality types that are always digging into curiosity.
Mm,
And so that's why I was wondering. I'm not an expert, but I just find that it doesn't fit the model for me. So, oh well,
yeah,
we
yeah.
tried.
Well, I mean, I feel again too, it could be, the unusual part of I just unless you've sort of lived it to really understand, like I totally understand the liberal perspective on everything and the conservative perspective on just about everything. And I understand their arguments, I understand their motivations, I understand their rationale. I think bouncing between those two homes is probably one of the biggest gifts I ever got. And I've never really thought about this, Rocky. So thank you for asking. But it's probably the best gift I ever got is to understand that you can look at one circumstance and you can have two totally different senses of reality around it. And then what I realized over time is that, and you get to choose which one you want.
Or you can also choose not to be stuck in either.
Absolutely. Yep. And then over time, I learned that there's a never ending supply of different ways of looking at things. And so I've spent a lot of time in my adult life trying to figure out what is the optimal mindset for this particular circumstance, because that's the one I want.
I think, in today's world, everything is black and white, but yet there are, the book is 50 Shades of Gray. There are all these different shades of gray in between there. And I think too often we don't spend enough time in the shades of gray. We're all actually, I shouldn't say that. I think the noise of the media is black and white. People are probably living in the gray, but it creates that. So how did you shift from the psychology space to the money mindset kind of money part of the psychology space?
Yeah, it's quite simple. It's quite simply me trying to figure out why I was so dumb to lose all my money day trading. Like, why did I do that? And so I just shifted that sort of psychological lens to money. And quite honestly, all I did was a lit review. So in your training as a psychologist, anytime you run across an issue or something you want to understand, you go to the literature. You go do a literature review to try to figure out what have scientists, psychologists said about this topic to date. And so I did a lit review and I couldn't find anything. And first of all, I was shocked because I was like, psychology's been around for several hundred years and money is the biggest source of stress in the lives of Americans. And by the way, the American Psychological Association found that in their studies. And at that point, it's like 3 out of 4 Americans, it's the biggest source of stress in their lives, above children, health, work, above everything. And I found it like appalling that psychology had ignored the topic altogether. And I sort of joke that within a matter of a couple of weeks, I became the world's leading expert in financial psychology, mainly because psychologists ignored the topic. I got really curious about that. And so I then did some studies on psychologists and other mental health professionals and found that they tend to be money avoidant. They don't really want to think about money. They think they have a negative association with money. And so I think that's one of the reasons why they avoided the topic. And so then I got even more curious about that. And so then I started to study that, essentially to try to figure myself out and then try to help other people.
It's funny because I've worked with therapists from a business standpoint. And one of the things I notice in that space is therapists in business are almost like oil and water because they're afraid to charge. They want to help. They want to do good. And yet, if you don't have enough revenue, you can't do any of that. And so there's that constant battle there. And I'm like, look, if you want to help people for free, you can. But in order to do that, you have to be highly profitable. So you've got to learn to at least charge where appropriate so that you can give when appropriate. And finding that right mix is so important. But yeah, I was, and you are literally at the cutting edge of this whole psychology of money space because nobody was talking about it. And I think that was my biggest struggle all the time. I would always look around and I would be like, I don't understand. Building wealth and compounding is so simple. It's a math equation. Do this stuff and you'll essentially over time get rich. Why are people struggling so much with this? And actually, the first person who actually tuned me into this was, and you probably know him, is Ramit Shetty. He was the one who turned me on to it. And through that, I met people who introduced me to your book, which was it's the Facilitating Financial Health book. And then I was like, oh my God, this makes so much sense. There are all of these different types of money mindsets. People behave in all of these different ways. And it just kind of unlocked for me understanding of that and so forth. And even now, it's funny because that same question I asked you, when I have a new business client that we're coaching on the financial side, that's the first question I ask them because I realize that whatever their core beliefs and programming is, that's how they're going to be in the business. And if they've got certain behaviors, they're going to keep blowing up the business. And I need to be aware of that.
That's right. And thank you for helping out the therapists. They need you, Rocky. We're very much drawn to the profession because we want to help people. And I remember it actually was said in my grad school program, like literally my professor said this, we are here to help people, not make money. And as somebody who grew up lower income, who's taken out a bunch of student loan debt, I'm like, I hope we make some money. I got to pay these loans back. And I was just even curious at that time, like, wasn't it possible to make money and help people? Is it possible to do both? And to your point, the last thing you want is your therapist struggling with money and stressed out and on the verge of bankruptcy. I mean, how available are they going to be for you if they're not healthy themselves in that way?
And that is so true. I still see it all the time. And I mean, as it is, business is hard. Trying to generate revenue is hard. And then when you throw those mindsets on top of it and the culture teaches you this, it becomes even harder to be able to deal with it. And those who break through at least have the ability to do that. Now, you've written tons of books in the space. Now, your dad's also in the space. So was he there first? Did he follow you? How did that all come to be?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I lost all my money in the stock market, one of the things I did is I interviewed my father. So at this point, neither one of us were at all involved in money, having anything to do with anything. Now, he was running a treatment center at the time, focusing on all sorts of other issues, none of which were related to money. And so one of the big blessings in my life is that my father and I started talking about it and working in this space and did a lot of the creation together, which was really, really cool. And he realized too that my father was always great in recognizing all the terrible things he was teaching me about relationships and about life growing up. And he got into therapy when I was a kid. And so he's trying to sort that out and try to be a better father and all that, which I admire greatly. And so it was pretty easy for him to start looking at himself around it too. So we got interested in it at the same time. I feel very blessed that many of our books we've been able to write together. And one of the first things we did a couple years after that was with the help of Rick Kaler, financial planner, we developed a treatment program at his treatment center that was focused on money. And so that's something we rolled out a couple years after we got curious about this and we're looking at ourselves and working on ourselves. And that's really what sort of threw us into the public sphere around it, because a Wall Street Journal reporter heard about the program, came and visited the program. And I'm walking with him in the treatment center. And he asked me, he said, wow, this is really interesting stuff. Do you guys have a book on this? And I said, well, it's funny you should ask because we're working on one right now. I then went to my father and I said, Dad, we got to write a book. That guy just asked me if we had a book. So we got to write a book. So that's what launched our first book.
What was the first book? Was it the Facilitating Financial Health, or was it a different book?
Nope, it was The Financial Wisdom of Ebenezer Scrooge.
Ah, that
That
one
was the
over
first
there.
book. Yep.
So it's funny because I read that book years ago and it really was enlightening. But here's the thing that really kind of threw me. Everybody knows Scrooge is a miser. Like we all focus on Scrooge and money. But what was interesting was Cratchit and money. Because when I looked at it, it was like Cratchit is the poor guy stuck in a system and he's never going to make much money. And yet in the book, you talk about some of his money behaviors that were kind of eye opening to me. One of them was the whole concept around that dinner. So, right, he goes out and he spends on this dinner. So let's put this in perspective. In today's dollars, how much did he spend on that dinner?
I
You
don't
know?
remember if we did an analysis on that, but it was way beyond what somebody in his position could possibly afford. That was our basic analysis of it. And I feel a little bad, here we are picking on Cratchit. But, I was Cratchit. I grew up in a family of Bob Cratchits. Who was Bob Cratchit? He was a smart, hardworking, earnest family guy, right? Who was not doing well, not able to provide for his family the way he wanted to provide for his family. And so it's real easy to point out Scrooge. And by the way, most of the book we're talking about Scrooge's transformation, but we did take a little side a side trip here to look at Bob and kind of hold Bob to account a little bit around like what were his beliefs that he's okay with being overworked and underpaid. Like why is that okay? There's so many of us that get stuck in a position where we feel like we're being mistreated, we're overworked, we're not getting paid enough, but we're feeling like we can't do anything about it. And so, yeah, we did do a little examination of why, first of all, why when he got money, did he blow it all on a lavish dinner for his family? And then secondly, what was his mindset that would keep him stuck and under the thumb of a boss like Scrooge?
And I think for me, it was I didn't realize how lavish the dinner was. I just assumed it was this basic dinner. And so that was kind of, wait, this was a lavish dinner? And then it was like, wait, he could have bought Tiny Tim medicine because the medicine would have been a lot cheaper than the dinner. But instead of buying the kid the medicine, he blows it. And honestly, now that you've said it, what you've said, how often do we see that in today's society, especially, with people in it who have struggles with money where they're blowing it on things that are I'll call it inappropriate, not for judgment, but they're not taking care of the basic essentials first is basically maybe the comment that's better said.
Yeah, I think that part of it is a sense of powerlessness and helplessness. And if you feel like you're in a bad financial situation, and if you don't know what to do, how to do it, if you don't have models for you that you can associate with, and you can be like, hey, if they can do it, I can do it. That's sort of where you need to land here. They can do it, I can do it. If you can't find somebody like that, the normal, I think, position is to just feel like no matter what I do, it's not going to matter. So in psychology, we call it learned helplessness, right? Escape's impossible. Why bother trying? And if that is your belief, if you do have a financial windfall, if you do have some extra money in your bank account, you are probably going to look to spend that now to enhance your life in some way without thinking about the future because you don't know any better.
Well, and it's also because if you don't do it now, it is that current moment mentality. They don't see a future that's better, so you might as well enjoy the moment. Today's episode is sponsored by Profit Answer Man Podcast. Did you know that most small business owners hate looking at their financials? It's one reason they may struggle with business success. The Profit Answer Man podcast helps them ensure they are profitable and can pay their employees and weather the storms we all have to face. It's built on the Profit First methodology of pay yourself first. The Profit Answer Man podcast is a must listen to for every small business owner and anyone who wants to help them survive and thrive. Check it out on your favorite listening platform.
This is a little sidetrack here, but I found it so fascinating. So I'm actually a fan of meditation. And meditation is is about immersing yourself in the present moment. Because in psychology, a lot of suffering, in philosophy too, and some religious beliefs, a lot of suffering comes from worrying about the past or the future. And so the idea is that if I can be present in the moment, that's where I'll find peace. That's where I'll find lack of anxiety. That's where I'll find connection. And by the way, I believe all of that. And studies have shown that the more you're focused on being present in the moment, the less you'll save for the future. So, ironically, the meditation is not good for people's investing behavior or their net worth in the long run. And so, I always say, so before the meditation, people get mad at me. By the way, I love meditation. Automate before you meditate. Okay, that's the bottom line. Automate your savings for the future, right? So that your goals are going to be met. So you don't need to worry about it right now, and you can focus on immersing yourself in the moment. But it's to your point. The more we're focused on the present, the less likely we are to be visualizing the future and taking the actions we need to take to have a better financial future, because that's kind of how we're wired. We're wired to not really worry about something so far off.
It's funny that you say that because I think the number one reason I had financial success wasn't something that I realized until much, much later and looking in the mirror. And that was the fact that I automated my savings. I'm like, wait a minute. It's not because I'm great at picking stocks. I actually suck at that. It's because I automated the building of wealth and I left it alone. I was actually able to have success and I had time on my side. I did that at a very young age. And just that simple action ensured that it was going to work. And so, yeah, I find that interesting. Honestly, that would probably be the simplest way to save. And I know they're going more and more to forcing people into a 401k if the company provides it, like the automatic enrollment and doing more of that. And technically, Social Security is the same concept. Too bad they didn't save the money, but you know, but if people could just almost be forced into saving, they would naturally build wealth.
They would. Now, what's interesting about those forced choice nudges, if you will, which are great, and essentially, instead of having people opt into a 401k, they have to opt out. So it's automatic that you're automatically enrolled unless you say you don't want to be enrolled. And what's so great about that, more people select, well, just by default, to then save for the retirement. However, there's a big problem with that. And the problem is that you have not sold people on why they're doing it. You have not sold people on an exciting vision of retirement. And then what happens, and by the way, I've talked to many administrators who will verify this for you, is that somebody all of a sudden opens up a statement 2 years later and says, "Oh, what's this? Oh, there's $6,000 in this account. Let's go to Disney World." And that's what quite often happens because you did not sell people on an exciting vision. And we did a study actually. We've done a couple studies, but one of them, we redesigned those 401k sign up meetings. And instead of showing charts of investments, we had people create a vision board of their ideal retirement. And in one study we did, after spending 1 hour thinking about money mindset, but more importantly, creating a vision board, I actually have one behind here that we used in the study of like, what do you value the most and what are your top financial goals? We saw people increase their savings by 73% as a percentage of gross income. So after 1 hour of picturing an exciting vision of retirement or your financial goal, we saw massive behavioral change. And then, of course, what we did is we encouraged people to automate it. So get clear about your goals, get excited about them, and then automate some sort of movement each month from your checking account to a savings account or a 401k or whatever it is, because it's the automatic guaranteed path to success.
That's interesting. I was not aware of that data, but it makes total sense that if they have that behavior, the behavior hasn't been changed. And I guess there's not enough safeguards to keep them out of the money. And so I assumed you were going to say when they switch jobs, they would cash it out, pay the penalty and go have fun, which is possible too. Yeah. It's funny how the things they think are going to work don't work. And you just have to kind of change the story. So, what are some of the most common psychological barriers that you see people go up against, regardless of how much money they have? Because it's not a, you know, I think these barriers happen regardless of how much wealth you have or not have.
Yeah, so there are a lot of them. And in terms of money mindset, we've done studies and now probably 100,000 people we've studied. And we did find some patterns of people who certain beliefs around money that are associated with terrible financial outcomes, self destructive financial outcomes. And three main categories. The first one we've already sort of talked about, that is, we called it money avoidance. So these are beliefs that rich people are greedy, money corrupts, there's virtue in having less money. Therapists score kind of high on that one, unfortunately. And of course, that's not good for you. Essentially, you'll sabotage yourself. What people who have that belief will, if they do accumulate some money, they feel bad about it, and then they find ways of getting rid of it, even if it's not conscious. The second category we found is what we called money focus or money worship. And this is where, and it's sort of ironic, and it comes with lots of conflicting information, if you will. So this is a heady topic, but we associate more money and more stuff with making us happier. And what's fascinating about that is more money actually will make you happier. There's been studies that have challenged the whole 70,000 a year thing, and the chart just keeps going up and up and up. However, it's incremental and it's not going to solve all of your problems. Like, so if you have, and as a matter of fact, it can create a lot of problems. So if all of a sudden you have enough money where you don't really need to work to sustain yourself, people love that concept. I mean, I'm a huge fan of financial freedom. I promote it all the time. And however, for many people, there's an existential crisis on the other end of that, where you've lost a sense of purpose, you've lost a sense of meaning. You have to find one. When you have to work, you have no choice but to work. You actually don't have to suffer with from a lot of that sitting around thinking about what's my purpose on earth, why are we here? So it can create some angst in that regard. But when you think more stuff is going to make you happier, materialism is associated with terrible emotional outcomes. So not great. The third category we found we called money status. And this is where it's the keeping up with the Joneses psychology. It's the hedonic treadmill, right? It's the more stuff I have, the more people will appreciate me, the more status I'll have. I tell people I make more than I actually do. This is sort of the social media disease that afflicts a lot of people, especially in the younger generation, where you're on Instagram and you're seeing people have stuff you wish you had, and then you go overspend because you have a sense of deprivation. Because you mentioned it too, Rocky. Like years ago, you're probably growing up in a community of everyone who's at a similar socioeconomic level. So you don't even know what you don't have. I mean, until you get the Sears catalog for the people who are older in the audience. Then you look in there and you're like, oh, I don't have that. I don't have that. Then you start to feel deprived. But now we see all over the place. You have people in low income areas constantly inundated on their phones with all this lavish lifestyles and all this stuff they don't have. Constant feelings of deprivation happening for many, many people. And that leads to overspending, not saving as much. So there are some real destructive mindsets that we have found in our studies on this.
Oh, I'm sure there's a ton. It's funny when you have financial freedom and you don't have to work and you don't have to do all these things, you still have problems. And now you become the biggest problem, the reflection in the mirror, right? You have to overcome yourself, and you got to go through that work, which is, I think that was kind of the genesis of the show. Hey, you got the money, but you didn't get all the happiness you thought that would come with it. And part of that is also, the fancy new car 6 months later is no longer the fancy new car. There's always a bigger boat, right? The fancy house, and you look out the window and the neighbor's got an even nicer one, or they updated. So it's that constant comparison that creates that issue. I had not heard, I've heard the studies of, the 70,000, which with inflation, I guess today is probably doubled or tripled, but I didn't realize that money continued to increase happiness all the way up the curve. I thought there would be a point where incrementally it really wasn't going to make a difference anymore.
Yeah, well, the studies have found that it keeps climbing beyond the 70. That's the point. Up into the hundreds of thousands, you know.
Okay.
If you have 500 million and now you get a billion, I don't think you're going to be twice as happy, you know. Um,
No.
and what's so fascinating too about financial freedom, and this comes from a large body of research, that when you ask people, are you happier on vacation than you are at the job you hate? Of course they say yes. Ugh. But when you actually give them these little rating things where you got to rate your happiness on a scale of 1 to 10 every hour, people are happier at work than they are on the weekends and on vacation. And that is something that's really, really tough for people to grasp. But the bottom line is that too much free time is terrible for your mental health. And there's something about work that provides a certain amount of challenge, a certain amount of focus. And what it does is it makes you forget about your problems. And meanwhile, if you have all weekend to sort of sit and reflect about the existential angst of existence, you know, it leads to more suffering. That's just the bottom line.
You know, it's funny you mention that because I don't have to work. I choose to work. But and I know this very clearly, this will lead to my next question. By having the work in the day, it creates boundaries for me. It gets me up into the gym early. It keeps everything else in focus. Otherwise, if there's nothing going on at 3 o'clock, it's like, maybe I should have a glass of wine. And then it's downhill, right? From that standpoint. I know, at least I'm fooling myself and thinking that I know how much is enough. But when you ask people that question, I find many people are on that, they can't stop. They're in that constant chase. And even the ones who have 10, 20, 50 million, it's like, oh, but I need more. And has anyone figured out how to say how much is enough for you to have that? We like to use harmony because balance is impossible.
Yeah, you know, it's a really interesting question. And just before I hopped on this call with you, I was writing a chapter for my next book, and the chapter is titled "Retirement is for Dead People." And we're taking a strong stance on it, but essentially, what is work? What's the definition of work? You know, retirement means to stop working, and the definition of work is essentially mental effort put into attaining some purpose, mental and physical effort to achieve a purpose. And I'm just going to suggest that we should never stop working. We should always have a purpose. We should always have a target, something that's bigger than ourselves that we want to put our mental and physical energy into. Now, that I don't care if that's you going pro at pickleball. To take the 80-year-old pickleball title, that's fine, but we have to have a purpose. It's sort of built into our psychology and in our DNA. And I'm sure you've seen it too, but I've seen many people who had early success. And it's actually even more painful when people have sacrificed their health, their relationships, all sorts of things to achieve this success. And then once they get it, it's a tragedy that they achieved it because what they thought was achieving this success was going to solve all their problems. It was going to fill that hole inside of them. It was going to make them happy. And certainly, you know, having money is better than not having money, but it doesn't fill that hole. And if along the way you have all this wreckage of bad health and people you've hurt and relationships that you've missed out on, it can be really, really terrible to actually achieve that goal. And so, anyway, I'm always left wondering what's the healthy part of it's not enough. And essentially, that could be I don't want to stop doing what I'm doing, but maybe I feel like I should. Maybe I feel like that's the message I'm getting from the culture. Like, oh, you have enough money. You should stop working. And so to combat that I need to find some other goal to get. And I wonder what people would do if they felt like it's okay to continue to achieve goals, even though you don't necessarily need the money, because maybe it's doing something for you that is worth much more than money.
And I agree with you. When I started out, I had the goal of early retirement. And once I walked away from work and I started to do what I love, I'm like, I don't know that I'm ever going to stop doing this. I may change how I do it. I may change how many hours I put into it, but it allows me consistent growth. It allows me to build new relationships. It allows me to stay on the cutting edge and sharp. And I don't, like you, I think retirement is death. So that's the case. And at some point, it's not necessarily, you don't even have to do it for the money. You can just volunteer and do it. And that's perfectly fine too. Actually, and so this is a business thought, because in the world of business, people say if people don't pay you, they don't value what you give them. And there's this constant argument around that. Do you know how true that is? Like, will people still value you if you give it to them for free, or do you have to charge? And some of them want to charge exorbitant because, well, they feel like then you'll do more. I don't know.
Well, I feel like there's an element of truth to it, for sure. The worst I have ever been treated in giving a speech was when I did it for a nonprofit and I did it for free. It was just the worst experience that I've ever had giving a speech. There's an element of truth to it. The other thing, too, is the thing that bothers me around that is when people are asking me to provide free labor that they are going to then use to monetize and make a bunch of money for themselves. That one just doesn't feel very good. That said, I volunteer tons of my time, but I feel like it needs to be at a place where you feel appreciated and you feel, because the bottom line is too that, well, let me put it this way. If we are doing a coaching session, you and I, and because I've been on the receiving end of this too. And well, I'll just tell you that. I'll just tell you my experience. So one time when I was early into my social media stuff, I paid for a guy's time. It was $500 an hour. And this was maybe 15 years ago. And at that point in my life, still today, $500 is a lot of money. I'll tell you what, I have never been more prepared for a meeting. I was having 60 minutes with this guy for $500. It was the most valuable 60 minutes I've ever had in terms of a coaching experience. And if I didn't have to pay anything for that, I guarantee you it wouldn't have been nearly as valuable. I just wouldn't have been there with that sponge mindset to take it all in because I valued this time so much. I think there is some truth to that. You get what you pay for, and people value it more when they have to, when they put more value on it, essentially.
Well, and then I'm assuming you took action.
Oh, well, you better believe I did. I paid $500 for that session. Of course I did.
Yeah, maybe that's why therapists should charge more. Then people will actually take action on their problems.
It could be. Maybe they'll do their homework.
What do you wish more people asked you about money, but rarely or don't ask you?
That's a good question. I think I would go towards the end game. I do this experiment all the time where I've done this my entire life, where I would fantasize about achieving a goal. Let me start with this. I think what I would want them to know, want them to ask me is money really going to give me what I think it will? Like, that's the question. And I have talked myself out of so many goals because I was able to visualize achieving it, visualize having achieved it. And it's like, for example, one of the goals I set for myself years ago is like, I want to publish 20 books. This was my goal. And then I sat and I visualized having published 20 books. And I'm like, okay. And I knew what it felt like. And I had that experience. And I was like, I immediately abandoned the goal, because I'm like, well, okay, so I did 20 books. Who cares? What was I trying to get from that? And I've done that on many, many goals. If I could live anywhere, where would it be? And I sit and fantasize, and I'm like, well, actually, right where I live now. And so I'm just really glad I didn't spend 10 years writing 20 books for the goal of writing 20 books. So I think that having a clear vision of what exactly it is you want in the future that you think money can provide you. Number one, perhaps it's true. And maybe from that visualization experience, you can pick out some elements that you can start getting right now, right today, at your current level of income. And so, for example, if your fantasy is to have financial freedom and you don't have to work anymore, what would you be doing? After the first 6 months where you clean your garage and you go out, do all the trips you said you wanted to do, 6 months later, what are you doing? Oh, I don't know. Maybe I'm playing a little bit more tennis. Well, then find ways to play a little bit more tennis right now. Like, you don't need to wait 30 years for that. So anyway, I think it's a really powerful mechanism to really try to figure out what will money actually give you? And is that something you actually really need? And is that actually something you can get right now?
And I know for me, it's constantly challenging the stories because social media says, oh, XYZ is awesome. And So we're sitting here today. I'm home today in my office doing this. Yesterday, I was on the sandy beach down in Florida doing my breath work down there. And I was like, with my eyes closed, I really couldn't tell that I was on. It didn't matter. And I'm more content being home. One of the things I used to ask people to do, and I've forgotten about that, and maybe we need to go back to it. I would tell them to go buy a lottery ticket, like one of the big ones. And I go, spend the dollar, $2. I don't, maybe they've gone up a little bit, but go buy the lottery ticket. Now go dream, right? Because it becomes the impetuous to say, what is my life going to look like once I have the lottery? And what are the things that I'm going to do differently? Now, why can't we start working towards that without the lottery, right? Why can't you start to make those kind of changes? The reality is, it's funny because I always tell people, if I were to win the lottery, the first thing I do is disconnect my phone and go hide. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, right? Because that's the problem you encounter. All of a sudden, your relationships with the world change because everyone looks at you as somebody that's going to hand them money, and if you don't, it creates all this ill will. And so, be careful what you wish for.
Yeah, everyone says, "Dude, run that experiment on me." But it's I totally agree with you. I totally agree with you. Because really what we want is this is really what it comes down to. We want stuff or money to give us one thing, and it's an emotional experience. That's it. That's what we want. We want an emotional experience. And when people think about, oh, I want to get that, Ferrari or whatever it is, that Lamborghini, the reason they want it is they want to have some type of an emotional experience, right? And to your point, that emotional experience is short lived. Like any shiny new object you get for your birthday, think about it back when you were a kid. That thing you coveted, that thing you wanted. 2, 3 months later, it's lost its luster. You're not going to be having that same emotional experience. So I think the goal is to figure out, like, what are those emotional experiences you want to have? What do you think that money is going to give you? How is that going to facilitate that emotional experience? And then go ahead and keep that as your goal. But what I want you to do is to start having that emotional experience right now, because because it's a practice. It's a practice. Like if you want to be happy, wealthy, you need to find ways to be happy right now, wherever you are. Because if you can't do that, no amount of money is going to set you up for this happiness thing because you have no practice being happy.
It's funny. Just last week, I helped my client sell his $500,000 Ferrari because we were over it. And, a bunch of other reasons. But yeah, it's funny how we end up doing things because of societal pressures, real or perceived, that cause us to make financial decisions that don't truly serve us. And I think that's probably one of the biggest lessons I've also learned kind of growing older is to let go of all of that. And honestly, the other thing, having to clean out 2 estates and having to fill the dumpsters, it really teaches you how to start getting rid of your crap, how to start like how to realize, wait a minute, all of this stuff is basically worthless. And why am I spending so much mental energy and so forth on that? We don't get a lot of emotional training though, do we? School doesn't teach you how to deal with your emotions. And clearly money's got a whole crap ton of emotions attached to it, but so does everything else. And you have any advice? How do we deal with, I don't know what's the right word. I don't want to tame my emotions. I want to dance with them. Is that the right word?
Yeah, I feel like a lot of it, you're talking to a mindset guy. I know you are one too. And for me, that's really what it comes down to. Whatever the circumstance is, it's understanding that we are the ones who are creating the experience. Because a range of people can have the exact same experience and have exact same like experience in the physical world and have entirely different takeaways and emotional experiences in the midst of it. And so I think the practice really is looking and accepting that we have the power. We're doing it automatically, but we also have the power to shift the way that we're experiencing things. And so I think it's a practice. I think it's a practice each and every day of what is the emotional experience I want to be having right now, and then to go ahead and have that emotional experience. I think that's the practice.
So I guess that's a learned thing of how to have the emotional experience and triggering your own in the way that you want to based on whatever the stimulus is, right?
It is.
Taking that moment.
And I think it starts with accepting that we are the ones creating our emotional experience. That's the hardest one. Okay. Because by the way, that's an internal locus of control. And so all the studies that I've done of thousands of people, and we looked at ultra high net worth versus middle class versus low income. One of the things that separates these groups of individuals is this concept of locus of control. And an internal locus of control is where you believe that the outcomes that are happening in your life are because of you. And so thank God that for whatever reason, I had an internal locus of control when I lost my money day trading, because it would have been really easy for me to blame whoever, tech, the housing market, government, my parents, whatever. And there's an unending list of people to blame things on. And the only way to actually improve your emotional experience is to gently and lovingly blame yourself, because therein lies the power. Therein lies the power. If I'll give you a quick example, like the way I look at my marriage to my wife is when things aren't going well, I immediately blame myself. Okay, so now the first thing let me back up. The first thing I do is I blame her. And by the way, for a lot of great reasons. So Rocky, I'm chronically underappreciated. Just so you know, I'm chronically misunderstood. And if she was just different, then everything would be great. So I go there, and then I realize, oh yeah, that doesn't work. And then secondly, I then go and I blame myself. So it's like, and what can I be doing differently here? Where am I not showing up the way that I ideally would like to show up, or the way she would like me to show up? And so what's amazing is when I blame myself, all of a sudden I have all the power of shifting my emotional experience with my wife. And if I blamed her, I would have zero power. And we can sit all day and argue who's got the power. But I'll tell you what, it works better for me when I feel like I have the power to make things better.
Do you know, like, we went out to society and took a poll, what percentage of people are internal versus external locus of control?
That's a really good question in terms of a population statistic, and I don't know the answer. But I do know this: internal locus of control associated with more money, better grades, quicker bouncing back from adversity, the entire spectrum of outcomes in terms of success, internal locus of control does better.
And I would almost bet that if you did studies across the world, you'd see that certain countries are certain ways and other countries are other ways. And I know you said that more internal locus is associated with more money, but I'd almost bet it, if you looked at it and you went to a lot of poorer countries, I'm assuming because they seem happier, maybe not. I'm just wondering how much they would look at it that way. It'd be an interesting concept to explore.
Well, let me just mention this because I think it's an important point. There's something in psychology called relative deprivation, and we define our well-being in relative terms, and it's based on our reference group. And so in the United States, all I have to do is go on Instagram and I immediately feel less happy because I see people who have more stuff than me, and guess what? They look really happy. COVID was a great example of all the single people saw these pictures on Instagram of the happy couple cuddling, reading books with their children in the background. Oh, I wish I wasn't so lonely. All the people with children would look at the Instagram picture of the woman drinking tea and reading a book and go, oh, I'd give my left leg to just be not bothered right now and read a book. So we're inundated by all this stuff that we don't have and all these experiences we don't have. And I think that creates a lot of suffering. If I'm in a much poorer country where we're all in the same boat, and maybe I am in poverty based on world standards, but if I have 5 goats and my neighbors have 2, I'm going to feel rich. It's relative. So that sense of well-being is relative. So that could be one thing that differentiates things. And certainly studies show that where there's a lot in countries and areas where there's a lot of economic disparity, that's where you get more violence and more discontent versus everyone being at one level or another.
That would make sense. And honestly, I think, turning off the phone, turning off social media, probably the easiest way to have more contentedness.
Yes, and also to understand that everybody's faking. Everybody's struggling with the same existential questions. The people on social media who are flexing all their rich stuff, they tend to be the poorest. I mean, you got to ask yourself, like, why are people doing that? Like, why this desperate need to show this stuff off? And if you have just sort of a basic understanding of human psychology around that, it immediately make you feel better.
That it will. It's time to learn the secrets of life. What's your secret to living an abundant life?
Secret to living an abundant life. For me, it comes down to just a really clear, I've gotten clear around what I value most. And what I value most is connection to the people I love. And so when I am experiencing that connection, I'm experiencing abundance.
For me, I think the biggest thing there is clarity. This is what I want. And then you can spend your time on what you want instead of being so distracted, kind of coming back to the social media. What did you learn later in life that you wish you would have learned sooner?
I would have loved to have learned how rich people invest. I spent a lot of time learning how they don't invest before I figured out how they do invest. And that's something that I wish I had known.
Out of curiosity, just nutshell, how do they invest?
Well, what I learned over time, and so I'm a CFP now, and I work in that industry, is that they're not necessarily taking more risks, and they not necessarily investing in things that everyone doesn't have access to. As a matter of fact, most people I know who are ultra wealthy, they invest in essentially the index, what the index would do, essentially, and they're not trying to beat the market at all. They're not trying to get rich quick. And that the people who are doing that are usually the ones who don't know much about investing and are about to lose all their money.
They're looking to just preserve their wealth and
That's right.
hold on to it. And that makes a ton of sense. I think that was one of the things that when I was young, I thought you got rich in the stock market. That's not the truth. You preserve your money in the market. You don't build your wealth in the market. Back to the day trading. If you were to give an 18-year-old one specific piece of wisdom, what would it be?
It would be, from now on, every dollar you get, invest 30% of it.
Finally, somebody who's got a real savings number. I too often it's like 10%, 15. You got to get that number up a bit higher, otherwise it takes forever.
I think so. All these people want to get rich quicker. That's how you do it.
That's how you do it. It's really that simple. Just automate, put 30% aside and, go have fun for a little bit. And next thing you know, you'll have freedom. And then you have to figure out what you want to do with it.
Do whatever you want with the other 70%. Live your best life.
Live your best life. Yep. I concur. If people would like to learn more about you, your books, your work, where's the best place for them to find all of that?
Probably on social media, like whichever one you love, at Dr. Brad Klontz.
And I will put that in the notes. And I know you're even on TikTok. So
it's true.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
What money behaviors do you need to work on? What's holding you back? What are your money mindsets? Have you ever asked, what does money mean to me? Or are you still running on the money programming from when you were a kid? Answer the question for yourself. Money is. Now the question is, does it serve you? For me, it's about freedom. That's what money provides. And I love my freedom. Next week, we've got Chris Duncan on to talk about how you're not broken and see you're perfect for you. You just got to accept that. By the way, if you enjoyed this episode, do you know someone who would also appreciate it? I would appreciate if you'd share it with them. And thank you for doing so. And thanks for listening. Have an abundant week.